at top speed in the autumn of 1901, in the early month or two, 6 weeks, say, of 1902. It was published at the time in Russia, in Russian. The name in Russian is Что делать? And it was a success among the rather limited audience to which he was sending it to, namely the people in the social democratic movement in Russia and interested parties. Of course, that was not a great, huge audience thinking of, in terms of a bestseller, but it did make an impact in the world that he wanted to make an impact on. So when we want to look at it today, we want to sort of have a sense of when he wrote it, why he wrote it, and for whom he wrote it, and that's what I'm going to try to go over today. So what I'm going to do is work in the following way. First, I'm going to sort of set what I believe to be the basic task that he and his friends had set themselves. And the reason this is he shared this task with the readers. I'll unveil what it is in a bit, but and he even shared it really with the people he was arguing with and polemicizing against. But because he shares it, it's not set forth in the book itself. It's sort of background. Everybody assumes it, and so he doesn't talk about it. But when we go back, we have to be aware of it. Then I'll look at the specific policy suggestions that are in the book. They're all aimed at the particular situation that was facing the Social Democrats, the Russian Social Democrats at that particular time and place. And so whatever cosmic meaning we may want to get out of them, we have to do it, as it were, through seeing what the specific thing he wanted done was first. Then I'll look at the polemics that are especially in the first two chapters of the book. They're obviously the most famous part of the book and the most controversial part of the book. Then I'll after looking at that, I'll step back and look at another feature of the book, the empirical justifications that Lenin made. That is to say, what did he paint the world as to make his policy suggestions plausible? And so, unfortunately, I think that the part of the book that is most famous now today is the polemics, which I will argue is perhaps not the most useful. The policy suggestions are also bound in time. The basic task is much more long-standing in Lenin's career, but not entirely. But the justifications that he gave, the empirical justifications, which you might think were the most ephemeral element of it all, I think is the one that reveals Lenin the most. So we'll see if I can make that case. Okay, what was the basic task? Well, I'm going to sort of quote from memory of a beginning of a chapter in this book I mentioned the other day, To the Rural Poor, a book that he wrote in 1903 to explain social democracy to a non-social democratic audience. And he says the name of the chapter is What do Social Democrats want? And the first line of the chapter is Social Democrats want, before everything else, political freedom. So that is the heart of the matter. Is the drive for, at that time, political freedom. That was, of course, not the ultimate task, but it was the overwhelmingly urgent on the agenda task. And I'll be arguing in the next, all three of my interventions here to say that at that time and place, for these people, political freedom was more the heart of the matter than the democratic republic. That this is the organizing concept. So that when you had banners in the 1903-04, it would say "Da здравствует политическая свобода," which means "Long live political freedom," and that was down with the autocracy, long live political freedom. But those are almost equivalent. So, and that's not quite a familiar. It's not unfamiliar really, but it's not one we think about or put central. So allow me a few words on exactly what was going on with that. Political freedom is essentially the set of freedoms that allow people to organize, to have a party, to have campaigns to persuade other people in an open forum. It's freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of organization, freedom of association, freedom to make strikes, and so forth. And what is, in the 19th century, the socialist attitude toward political freedom was very ambiguous, that is to say, for a lot of the time, hostile. It was a bourgeois fraud, to use the term that we heard earlier. It was why overthrow, say, the Tsar, just to allow a bunch of liberals to come in and have their newspapers, which no one could read anyway. I mean, the people couldn't read. And so Marxism really was an exception and challenged other socialisms precisely on this basis, that Marxism said that political freedom was essential task, essential precondition. And the reason is, I think it's, I don't have to go through it in great detail, is if the working class has a historical mission to take power and introduce socialism, then it has to understand and take on and be ready for this mission, and it has to be at least the national sphere, and in order to do that, you can't just be talking to people, you can't just be sort of rabble-rousing in a village or a town. You have to have newspapers, you have to use modern means of communication on a national level, and for those you need the legal and political space provided by political freedom. So it was absolutely essential. The metaphor that is used, and it's used by Engels and by Kautsky and by Lenin and by a whole series of people, is that political freedom is the light and air for the proletariat. And the concrete application of this is what I call the SPD strategy. The SPD is the German Socialist Party, the Social Democratic Party, and they were a very innovative party in that they were the first party, I think, of mass campaigns, mass agitation, day to day, all around the year, never stopping agitation with professional people who did this full time. I call it a word I used in my book, but I've now extended it a bit, campaignism. That is to say, it's the idea of the permanent campaign of trying to bring the message to the workers, to convince them, to persuade them at all levels and all ways you can think of, through organizations, through like singing groups, for some big thing in the social democratic strategy. And so that was what Marxism stood for at this time, and many of the revolutionaries and other socialists at the time thought that this was very wimpy and a sellout, that they were trying to do this way. Okay, it's gone over to Russia. It's the same story, that the first generation or so of revolutionaries were again hostile to the idea that you needed political freedom. What you wanted was to overthrow the Tsar, and then you get socialism sort of right there, then and there. And anything less was a sellout. Anything less would keep the capitalists in. If you brought the capitalists in, you may never have a revolution. That's what some of them said. And so it took a generation or so of working through the problems and trying things out for the Russian socialists and revolutionaries to realize that you weren't going to get anywhere unless we had this some political freedom in order to get the masses on your side, and not just go and try to start a riot in a village or something like that. And one of the figures that who is a martyr in this process, a martyr is, using Lenin's term, is Lenin's older brother, the one who you all know, I'm sure, but tried to assassinate the Tsar and failed and got hung. Why was he trying to do? What was he trying to accomplish? He was a socialist who had got to the point where you've got to get political freedom, and he sacrificed his life to get it, because he thought the only way you can get it, you need political freedom to have a mass movement. But before the Tsar is killed, before the Tsar is overthrown, you can't have a mass movement by definition. Therefore, the only way to get the conditions for mass movement is through terrorism or through individual action of that kind. So you have a situation where terrorism, in order to get a mass movement, individual conspiracy in order to get a mass movement. And Lenin later on said that Russia suffered its way to Marxism, and this is what he meant, that I think he had his brother mainly in mind, but it was the whole generation of people working out that they really needed political freedom. So, and Lenin, speaking biographically, in the early 1890s, why in the early 1890s was he so taken with Kautsky's Erfurt program book, with the SPD looking, here's a young Russian trying to figure out these problems, looking west. Why was he so taken by this? And I think it's because he saw them as a possible answer to his problem, which was a way of getting political freedom in Russia. So here's the book by Kautsky, where Kautsky says, political freedom is light and air, and anyone who neglects the fight for political freedom is doing a proletariat a grave disservice, and this has got to be the top of the agenda. And Kautsky also representing, in some ways, of course, the sort of standard line in the West, sort of said, and the bourgeoisie can no longer be counted upon to get political freedom. They're losing their interest in it rapidly. If the bourgeoisie was ever capable of doing this, it's less and less so. So if we're going to get political freedom, it has to be in countries where you don't have it, or you need more of it. It's going to be the working class probably, or has to be, or it won't happen. And he and the SPD strategy then was to have a message have the message sent to the propagated to the workers, to the masses. But how can you do that under absolutism? What Lenin and a generation and a whole generation in the 1890s started working out was a way of applying the SPD strategy in Russian absolutist conditions. That is to say, almost the opposite of they wanted to do the SPD strategy in the absence of political freedom. That's almost a paradox, or is a paradox, but they started working on ways of doing it, and they worked out in practice various ways of sort of local committees that had sort of threads that would connect them to the factory workers, and they would work alongside the factory workers to get strikes, but they would also set out their message, and they could be known as the friend of the workers, but they would, and if to much the extent possible, they would get literature from abroad. So they worked out bit by bit how to do this. Okay, so, but now let's fast forward to about 1900. What we have in 1900, 1901, and sort of like this, is two things. First, there is a local social democratic committees in many of the cities in Russia, and there is the idea around that there's such a thing as a national party. That is a good idea, and we also have increasing militantization. Anyway, militancy. That's what I want of the workers. So the Iskra group. Iskra is of course the name of the newspaper. The Iskra means the spark, and the whole idea of the spark was the paper itself would be a spark, and it's going to be set to combustible material. The combustible material is there. We're the spark, but the combustible material is out there. Their mission was to take the party to the next step of getting national institutions and so having a national presence and a national organization. Okay, so and Lenin's the Iskra had started up in late 1900, and then it hadn't been in existence a year when Lenin wrote an article saying, I'm going to write a small book, comrades. I'm going to get it out for you. In which I'm going to set forth my ideas, or our ideas, about how to get from A to B, how to get from these separated organizations to something that would be a cohesive national organization that would really make a difference, and not more than make a difference, would help bring about the Tsarist overthrow. And he said, we agree, we've been arguing with economism, but that's over. We're in a good place here. So I am actually going to write a book without polemics. So when you look at what has to be done, I'll briefly explain later why there are so much polemics in it. But it's because of events that happened factionally after he wrote that. So in the summer and fall of 1901, and I'm sorry to be so detailed about the months, but I think it brings out something about the book, that this was written in a real time, in a real place, and the more concrete we can sort of see Lenin sitting at his desk and what he was reading and what he was responding to, the better. So it ended up being very polemical, and the polemics got to the front part of the book, and the concrete policy suggestions got to the second part of the book, and so people have a tendency to not get further than the political polemics in this first part, and the second part, the third, those chapters get kind of, I think, a little lost in the shuffle. So what I'm going to do, and it's a possible suggestions for reading this book, is to go backwards. I'm going to start at chapter 5, chapter 4, chapter 3. Those are the last three chapters. Are each devoted to one of his suggestions, and then we'll take a look, such as it is, at the polemic part. Okay, so the three tactical suggestions or policy suggestions at the time. Okay, the chapter 5 is about Lenin's idea of using a newspaper as a way of getting from the local committees to national institutions. Because how do you do that exactly, especially under the very bad conditions of absolutist Russia, where you couldn't communicate, you couldn't send anything to the mails, you couldn't. You had a hard time keeping any sense. How do you manage to get these committees to first? And the dilemma is, in order to have the committees come together, you needed unity, a sort of outlook on the committee's part, so they could go together and form it. But in order to have unity, you needed a national organization, because otherwise, people are just working on their own. So that's the dilemma. So there's a rather ingenious way out, which he said, what we're going to do is we're a self-appointed group. We're not official in any way. We are openly self-appointed, but we're going to go from abroad, send a newspaper out to everybody. It's going to propagate some programmatic message that will unify the committees, because we'll persuade them one by one to adopt our platform. And so ideologically, we're going to unify them, and we're also going to unify them practically, because they're going to be our collaborators on the paper. They're going to send us material. We're going to use the material. We're going to send them the paper. They're going to distribute it. For the first time, we Social Democrats are going to work together on something national. We're going to make ourselves a national voice, a national presence, all Russian presence. So, and if all went well, in a year or so, because we would be in a position to call a party congress, and the party congress would come, and it would be unified ideologically already because of the Iskra platform, and Iskra would be appointed the official party newspaper then, and would lose its private status, and that would solve that problem. So that was the idea, to use the newspaper. Of course, the newspaper, a party newspaper, is a standard SPD technique. They had tons and tons of them. And what Lenin said was, listen, the SPD people, throughout the book, he's always looking enviously at the SPD and the model, and uses it as a model. I have a section in my book called "Look at the Germans," because that's what the phrase he uses. Look at the Germans. Now here's what they do, and so we've got to try to do as much as we can. So he says, they have a billion ways of getting the message across. We have almost nothing. We have leaflets and newspapers. So we have to really use the ones we've got to maximum to get to the next step. So that's the idea of using the newspaper as the next step. And people can comment on this, but I sort of got the idea when I was hearing some of the CBGB's strategy yesterday. It sounded a little bit Iskra-ish. That is to say, send out a message in order that there be later unity based on that message. But you can tell me more. And then another thing about the newspaper he was eloquent about was more than just sort of internal party matters. Oh, by the way, so I want to emphasize that he's not talking about anything about party organization after you're constituted. He's not making recommendations on that level. He no doubt had his opinions. He no doubt wanted this or that, but he He was not talking about the Central Committee, what kind of powers it have, or what kind of powers it wouldn't have. He wasn't talking about discipline, local autonomy. He was talking about getting how to get a Central Committee when there wasn't one. That's what he's talking about, what is to be done. Later on, disputes were of a different kind. But that's what is to be done, that's what he's talking about. And then the newspaper is also there to make people aware of each other. That is to say, the idea was, again, this goes back to the idea of combustible material. There is a bunch of people out there, everyone hates the Tsar, not only us workers for our reasons, but the nationalities, the teachers, the zemstvos, that's the local sort of gentry self-government institutions, even the bureaucrats and the capitalists and even some landlords. Everyone, he says, is just sick and tired of this incompetent bunch of thugs. And so, but no one dares do anything because everyone else sort of feels that they're the only one, you know? So, and also, is there a mass force? Because it's okay for everyone complains, but they can't do anything, then nothing happens. But the paper is going to first have a national presence, make everybody aware that, you know, you're going to publish complaints from the Finns about their lack of independence. You're going to complaints from the school teachers about the way they're being shoved around. They're getting complaints from people who put in petitions and they got arrested for it. So you're going to make everybody aware of everyone else's dissatisfaction, and you're going to get the workers, everyone aware of the fact that the workers are more and more a mass force that puts this on the agenda, makes it possible, puts it in the realm of possibility that we can really overthrow the Tsar with a mass basis. Okay, so that's chapter 5. Now, moving back, chapter 4. And this is the chapter I sort of devoted to professionalism. And the word professional revolutionary, I advocated the translation profession, what I call revolutionary by trade. But I'm not wedded to that. That was just out to bring out some points. And since this professional revolutionary is the common term, I'll keep on using it. I usually use it just because it takes too long to explain all the what's going on out there. Okay. And also, you know, there are many terms to the connotations of the word professional, and I objected to some of them in my book because I said it has a sort of an elite whiff of elitism. You know, doctors and lawyers and architects, the specialists who are highly trained and to whom we defer because so I said that was not what was meant. It was more like a worker knowing his own trade very well. But in any event, there is one connotation of professional that I think is what was going on. That's in the term professionalism. Like he did a professional job about it. Let's be professional about this, comrades, and so forth. So that term in English does bring out what Lenin wanted. He says, so the opposite of professionalism is not democracy or not a mass party, or it's sloppy amateurism. And the special form, which was most relevant for him at the time, was local isolation. Because, and that's what he sort of drove him absolutely up the wall, was he said that people are sitting there, people in Kiev don't know what's going on in Moscow and they don't care. The people in Kharkov don't know what's going on in Petersburg. So what we got to do is get into a national organization that would stop this inefficiency. And so that's why he used the word kustar, which means handicraft or artisan, because in the back of that metaphor, the back of it is sort of a kustar versus a factory, a modern factory with division of labor and with a nationwide market. Whereas the kustar is just, he may be very skillful himself, but he's doing very inefficiently making things for a very local market. No, we want to move past kustar, which I translated rather clumsily, kustarnichество, I translated as artisanal limitations. But we have to move beyond that to get national organization. And so now, where did he get his idea of an underground organization? So this, the argument I'm going to make forth is something I took from other writers, Bolshevik writers of the time. It's not Lenin's. I think he sometimes hints at this, but it's not his argument. This is what other people are saying, but they were his at the time, and I agree with them. That is to say, what he is doing is idealizing, I mean, bringing out the logic, and when I say idealizing, I mean bringing out the logic in a schematic way of the underground organization that has been worked out in practice in the last decade or so. The attempt to apply the SPD logic to the Russian conditions it had been worked out empirically. What he did was look at that and present the logic of it in a book that could be read by everybody and put in an inspiring job. This is how we do it, comrades, and let's do a good job of it. Let's train ourselves. Let's take this seriously. Let's think about it. Let's get a professional division of labor going and so forth. And some of the critics of him, the Menshevik critics later on and other critics, were sort of said, oh, come on, what is all this specialist division of labor where one person does the newsprint, the other person does the passports, and the third person does the... He says that's kind of soulless bureaucracy and kind of ridiculous. But that was at least a criticism of something that Lenin was actually advocating. And so one of the things I like about my book is bringing out this word conspiratia. It's a word that was used by the undergrounders, and it's never that word is not translated as conspiracy, conspiratia. If you read the other earlier translations of what is to be done, they've translated as secrecy usually, or sort of underground conditions. So what I think we should think of as something, the logic of conspiratia. Conspiratia is sort of a set of rules to keep yourself from getting arrested by the police. It's what I call the fine art of not getting arrested. And but what I also think conspiratia, and this is something a term I didn't use in the book, but there's something I would say that we have here is conspiratia underground, a type of underground based not on conspiracy, but even on the opposite logic of conspiracy, but on the idea of having an underground organization that actually has mass roots by distributing literature, by helping out with strikes, by this and that and the other thing. So, conspiratia, I sort of say, is the opposite of conspiracy. Conspiracy is you want to keep the information in a small group as possible, so that this small group can go and knock off somebody, or have a palace coup or something. Conspiratia is the opposite. It's the set of procedures needed to get the message out as widely as possible. And then what is to be done is a discussion where he says, some critic of his says, there's no such thing as a secret strike. And he says, well, yes, there is, comrades. You can have a strike. It's no secret to anyone in that town. But it's a secret to everybody else in Russia because the word hasn't gotten out. Well, that's our job, to get that word out, to let everybody know about that strike. But in order to do that, of course, we need to be careful. We have to have underground conditions with people who are full-time getting them, the message has to go from Kiev, where the strike is, to Geneva, where they're making the paper, back to Russia again to distribute it. This requires professionalism. It requires, the logic of conspiratia to, all these basic empirically worked out rules for not getting arrested and for maintaining the organization. Well, I could go more on about this, about the underground organization, and how it worked. But the big point I want to make is that, number one, that he comes out of a tradition, and number two, everybody accepts most of the ideas that he says here. These are not the controversial parts. The word professional, the term professional revolutionary, was adopted by the entire underground because, including the Mensheviks, including the social revolutionists, I imagine anyone, even the cadets, the constitutional Democrats, the liberals, insofar as they had an underground organization. If you're going to have a functioning underground organization, you need something like professional revolutionaries, and everybody accepted this. So I often say that the least important thing about the term professional revolutionary was that it was coined by Lenin. It was coined by Lenin, but and it's only used in this chapter. He himself did not. I don't think he even realized that it was an innovation because it was in the air. So if you read the book, you'll find out he doesn't say, "I have a new concept, comrades, professional revolutionary." and its role in the party. No, he just argues, he just sort of says, we want to be professional revolutionaries, don't we? Well, then let's do it right. So it's, I think he was, and this also with the other parts of his general idea of conspiratio and all the rest of it. I'll just say one more thing about the professional revolutionaries, is that it was not supposed to be restricted in any way to intellectuals. In fact, there's no particular connection between the idea of intelligentsia and professional revolutionary. It's that if there is a connection, it's only bound in time, at a particular time and space, and that later on as he was writing, there was already a sort of a workerization going on of this apparatus, and it continued throughout the rest of the underground period. So to sum up on the organization, and I'll connect it to the strategy, what I see is what the organizational ideal here is try to put together two things that seem opposite: mass organization and underground. And a lot of the commentary on what is to be done sort of says these are the opposites, and he choosing underground. But what's going on really is to try to do as much as possible the strategy, the logic of a mass organization under underground conditions, in order to overthrow the Tsar, so that you could do a better job of having a mass organization. So the way I sort of said, let us have. I sum up Lenin's strategy here as saying, let us put together an organization as much as like German SPD as we can under Russian absolutism, so we can overthrow the Tsar and have an organization even more like the German SPD. That is sort of what that's all about. Okay, moving back a chapter. How am I doing on time?
You're fine.
Okay, yeah. We go to the chapter on political agitation. Or I should say, political agitation, because that's where the emphasis lies. And again, this was meant as a specific emphasis for a specific time and place. He's saying now the time has come, both in terms of where the workers are and where we are and our organization are, and the general situation is to really put an emphasis on political agitation. One reason for this is that now Iskra is a national newspaper, and political questions are national, so we can, or more tend to be more national than economic questions. And so now we can do this in a way we couldn't do it before. So to get a flavor, I think, of Lenin's approach, there's a passage in there somewhere. I'm sorry I don't have my book here or the thing to give you page numbers, but where he talks about the move from economic agitation to political agitation. Economic agitation had already been carried on, especially by papers like, there were underground papers, Robochaya Mysl, if you want to know the name, which means worker thought, that have been concentrating on this. And he said, and also what the local organizations have been writing leaflets. What you do is, the leaflet was prior to the newspapers and afterwards, a highly important form of organization. When I say leaflet, sometimes these things are very dense and go on for quite a bit. So it's not just a bunch of slogans and a caricature. So, and they would go, some local committee guy, some intelligent. Intelligent is something more than, is something wider than intellectual, because an intelligent just means someone who's educated enough to be able to read and write and listen to the people. So some intelligent would go to the workers and say, well, what's the problem here in the factory? And they would tell him, and he would try to write it all down and make a list of it and make a list of strike demands. They would do a leaflet. They would complain about. So that was economic agitation. You would say, what's on your mind, workers? Where are your grievances? And then they would make a thing, and if there was any room, they would say, and by the way, you should overthrow the Tsar. So what Lenin says is, listen, when we had economic agitation, which is a year or so ago when he was writing this, the workers were they really wanted, they had their story to tell. They went out, they were thrilled. The local organizations were overwhelmed with this stuff. So he said, but don't think that's only economic. Don't think it's only that the workers care about political. They care about political issues. As a matter of fact, today, in day-to-day terms, they probably hit more against the political restrictions and limitations of Russia than the economic ones. Well, later on I'll read. So I'll read it to the guy right here. He sort of says, why does the Russian worker still show in so limited a fashion his relative revolutionary activeness in connection with the police's, these are types of political issues as opposed to economic issues. The police's bestial treatment of the people, the narod, the persecution of sectarians, i.e. religious dissenters, the corporal punishment of peasants, the outrages of the censor, the torment of the soldiers, the persecution of the most harmless cultural undertakings, and so forth. He says it's because the workers only care about economic struggles? No, it's because we're not doing our job in getting out the news to them about these outrages. We can go out there and we'll do it. We must blame ourselves, our falling behind the movement of the masses, since we've not been able to organize indictments of these despicable things in a sufficiently broad, clear, and timely fashion. And he has this metaphor, I don't know if it's here or somewhere else, where he says, we just have to throw it out to them, and they will respond. If we do this, and we must do it, and we can do it, and we must do it, and we can do it, is this sort of thing like, this is doable if we think seriously about methods and how to do it, and so on. The very simplest worker will understand or will feel that the dark force that mocks and oppresses the student and the sectarians, the mujik, and mujik is peasant, and the writer is the same that oppresses and weighs on him at every step of his life. And when he does feel this, he will himself desire, with an overwhelming desire, to respond. And he will know how to do it. Today, and he goes through a bunch of stuff. Today, they will demonstrate in front of the governor, and tomorrow they'll beat up a priest or something like that. So this is the sort of, by the way, the sort of eloquent passage that when we get too concentrated on the polemics in the first two chapters that we're missing over. This is the essence of Lenin, this sort of, for me this is the exciting part about Lenin, where he says the same dark force that mocks and oppresses the student, oppresses and weighs on him. And that's exciting stuff, and that's what we should, I think, of in Lenin. Okay, so that's one side of political agitation, that the worker, political agitation to the worker. The worker is ready, willing, and raring to go to do political agitation. We're moving into the end game with overthrowing the Tsar, and this is what's going to happen. So along with that, also political agitation, this sort of idea of to all classes. And exactly what Lenin has in mind here, I tell you, I'm a little vague. And one reason is that they were in a particular situation when he wrote the book, that the Social Democrats were the only organized party, underground party around at that time. The Socialist Revolutionaries hadn't got themselves together. The Liberals hadn't got themselves together. But as he was writing the book, these organizations started coming, and so they would represent other groups. So when he started to write the book, anyway, the SPD would be the only ones sending revolutionary messages to anybody. So he said we should also, to the extent possible, send the message to all classes. And that had two sides of it. First of all, that the workers, this should have a view of the whole situation. Our message to the workers should not be restricted to working class problems. And secondly, the other classes all have an interest, or many of them have an interest in political freedom and overthrowing the Tsar. They should be made aware, the way I was describing earlier, that revolutionary change is possible. And when they realize that, they will help us, our party, because we're the main force working against this. That's the part that became outdated rather rapidly. And therefore they'll help us. And a lot of what he's saying here is that we can get a lot of help from these people, from whistleblowing, like scandalous documents from the bureaucracy, to giving an apartment or something like that. I mean, some professional revolutionary type wants to be, needs an apartment to stay overnight. Some respectable professor or doctor might give him a room. The police would not be so. So that's the sort of thing. And yes, okay, well, we're getting there. It's moving toward, or is an adumbration of what the hegemony model, or hegemony, is that how you pronounce it? Well, I'll get to that in a second. what is to be done does not really get, I think, to actually the center of what Lenin's strategy is, because that involves the work with the peasants and the leadership of the peasants, and but he's now in sort of pre-step of getting leadership, getting the organization, the party organization together. Okay, the polemics are in the first two chapters, and just very briefly, why are they there? Well, there was as I said, in spring 1901, Lenin says, "Oh, this is going to be relatively unpolemical." Then this other organization, another immigrant organization, Рабочее дело, which means worker cause, it's a newspaper, had been kind of hostile to the Iskra group, but they said, let's get together. Okay, fine, let's get together. They had a unity congress, in like September, I think, and it immediately fell apart, and both sides left screaming at each other, and then the other side opened up artillery first, and they had an issue where they blasted Iskra with two big articles. The Iskra people responded. Plekhanov wrote a nasty article, Martov, Lenin threw in his contribution, and the last pièce de résistance of this campaign against this was going to be Lenin's book. And when you in correspondence, you often refer to this, I'm finishing up my book against Рабочее дело. So he sort of saw this now as one of the main missions of the book, perhaps unfortunately. And he wrote it at top speed. So, for example, and almost every article that he mentions, that he criticizes, that he responds to in this book was published in fall 1901. It's hot off the press stuff. It's not like long-lasting debates, but just right there. Not only this one debate I've talked about, but practically everything. And, for example, we spent a lot of time with his relation to the Kautsky, the article and the Kautsky quotation. Again, that was top speed. So in September or October or something, the latest issue of the Kautsky, the Neue Zeit, did I pronounce it, comes out, and it has an article by Kautsky, and Lenin says, "Aha! That makes that boy, if those Рабочее дело people could see that, they would." So he throws it in, and it is literally thrown in. You can sort of see that Lenin is going on with his own argument. He says, "And Kautsky has written a good article. Here's what he says." Then after having the quote, he goes on with his own argument. So I tend to
quote on what?
On the famous, full without, yeah, the most famous one. So I'll make the case, therefore, that what is to be done is not a good place to get Lenin's theoretical or programmatic outlook. And it's partly because it's been misused in that way that it's led to distortions. And I got some reasons for this. First of all, it's polemics with passing, it's a passing polemic. Now, of course, you can bring out, any polemic will bring out, you can extract general principles, but this was one polemic with one set of people. And he uses their vocabulary a lot of the time, and so it isn't like he's setting out his thoughts in his own terms. He's sarcastically using their terms. He himself and his supporters all more or less admitted that he had not formulated the position very well. Now, I got to be careful about this, because he did not say, "Oh, I went too far." No, what he said was, "I did not express myself very well," which is different. He said, "What I meant to say was perfectly uncontroversial and perfectly orthodox, and if I didn't express it well, I'm sorry, comrades." I mean, that's more or less what it is. He doesn't stress this, of course, but I think I can come up with the quotes where he and others more or less say this. They say, what happened was that everybody liked this book, but when the Mensheviks turned against us, they went over the book with a microscope and tried to find defective formulations. And the implication there is, and they found them, and they deliberately used verbal problems to make Lenin look silly, which of course is what we all do when we're doing these things. Okay, what is to be done? Again, this is a defense made at the time. It's not programmatic in that it's not aimed at setting off. What Lenin meant by programmatic was something that's global, something that sets out the whole waterfront of Central, as opposed to an issue that's important at one time, and then another issue that's important another time, and another emphasis is important at one time. That's that's what this kind of polemic is, he said, whereas a programmatic is where you set out a program which is supposed to cover the waterfront and give a full global view of what you want. And there are lots of problems and aspects and things that I didn't talk about in what has to be done. So don't take this as an expression of my entire views. Furthermore, as I mentioned, some of the basic views behind the book were common between him and his readers, so he didn't go into them. Back to political freedom. And finally, the book did not say something that was important to him at the time, vital to him, and I think more vital to him throughout his career, his view on peasant policy. So for all these reasons, I would actually, if you're interested in his programmatic views and his outlook, read this book I'm touting, To the Rural Poor, or a number of his other books on the peasant question. Okay. So I'm dismissing the polemics here, but let me just say what he did not say. He did not say workers could not attain, it was impossible for workers to attain proper cross-consciousness. He did not say only intellectuals make good revolutionaries. He did not say only professional revolutionaries should be party members. The party should not, he didn't say the party should be restricted to professional revolutionaries. He did not say the party should be a tight conspiratorial elite. And he did not, in this book anyway, advocate a high level of centralism or discipline. That just wasn't one of the problems that he was addressing. What he did say was that the party has a job to bring the message, to organize, and if we do a good job, people will respond. The workers will respond. They'll be interested. They'll bring it, and they will come. Send the message out. Do our job, and it'll happen. Okay, I sort of run out of time, but I do want to give at least one more quote, and because I didn't get to the section where I wanted to say about what kind of justification did he use that these were possible. Because it's a strangely ambitious project. It kind of, here's the mighty Tsar, and here's a bunch of cafe sitting around immigrant revolutionaries who think they're going to overthrow the Tsar. How the hell is this possible? You have to make a whole series of extremely optimistic assumptions. And the optimistic assumptions have to be that the workers are ready to go, that there's dedicated revolutionaries around we have a sort of steady supply of people who will get themselves arrested, and eventually, I mean, they only lasted 6 months to a year before they got hauled off. So you needed a sort of steady supply of heroes, really. You need a sense that not only will the paper get there, but that it'll be protected. That workers will understand this rather arcane. If you saw Iskra, you see that it was very small print, and it had a very dense message, and it was not dumbing down in the slightest. So all series of very optimistic assumptions needed to make this whole thing plausible, to even sort of make it make sense. And he did make those optimistic assumptions. He was saying our workers right now will do this, we'll support it, and we have revolutionaries, we have everything ready to go, we just need to put it all together. And so that's the kind of thing I was talking about in the essay I sent you, The Echoes of What Is to Be Done, is the kind of passages where he says the workers as followers, they're ready to go, I read that passage, it's a very good one about we give them the message and they will respond. Workers as possible leaders, there's tons and tons of talent out there. It's our job to get that talent out and use it, to bring them up, to make them professional revolutionaries. And the more professional revolutionaries we have out of these people, the more unbeatable the party will be. He consistently uses words like miracle, he says, you guys talk about your practical, this is my favorite quote from the book. You guys talk about, my opponents, you talk about practical. We have to be practical. But any pratique, and that's pratique is the Russian word meaning the local activist, any pratique will tell you that miracles will occur when alone pratique can accomplish these miracles. And once I started looking for it, the word miracle, chuda in Russian, it's a rather common word in Lenin. And so that's what I find the echoes of. The policy prescriptions, you know, they sort of fade because they're bound in time and space. But the sort of optimistic assumptions about the revolutionary consciousness and the way it's going, that's what we find again and again in Lenin later on. Okay, so if someone asks, I can give you, I can talk about the further fate of what is to be done afterwards, but I'll let that go now. And open for questions. Thank you. One was the professional revolutionary and the dangers therein, and the other was the Kautsky theme. So I'll start with Kautsky and Lenin's relationship to him. And Peter said the main thing here, which is that I think it's reasonable to have thought that when you pick up the works of Lenin after 1914, he's always pounding something called Kautskyism, and yelling, and every page has something sort of practically spluttering. In fact, I think all of Lenin's friends said he's overdoing. He's got some sort of emotional problem with this. But when you look closer, what it means is Kautskyism means renegade behavior. I mean, I go into somewhat more detail, but it does not mean a set of ideas that Kautsky. It's not Kautskyism. In fact, the Russian word is not ism. It's Kautskyanstvo. So, and that's just a verbal point. But the essence of the matter is that the whole point of Kautskyism that he's attacking is Kautsky's refusal to live up to what he said earlier. And that's why the opposed to the Kautskyism is Kautsky when he was a Marxist. Now, so that's this I've got a rather long thing about this, but let me mention a couple of things that were brought up. One is the role of Kautsky beforehand. One thing was Lenin brought up the party to one way, and Kautsky brought up the German party another way, and the German party failed in the Lenin party. Well, the two things wrong with that was, first of all, Kautsky did not bring up the German party. He was just, he was just a theorist who had less and less influence on things as went by. And as soon as 1914 came along, that was the end of his career, more or less. He was tossed aside, and not even the independent party took him too seriously. But the Bolshevik party, they lived on Kautsky. They read, I'm sure that the Bolshevik party people read much more Kautsky than any other writer, including Lenin, continually, all the time. And look at this Moira Donald's book on Kautsky, and there's a whole book, Kautsky, a bibliography of Kautsky's works. Russians loved Kautsky, and I also have a sort of reading list of some from 1908 of a Kautsky of a local circle in Russia, and it's Kautsky, and maybe a Lenin pamphlet on from a couple of years ago, because for a variety of reasons, Lenin. It was difficult for, what is to be done is out of date, that's not going to work, and two tactics is out of date, this is 1908. But Kautsky, in season, out of season, he's the textbook, he's the authority in a wide range of topics. And one of the first things that sort of led me to start rethinking this Lenin-Kautsky relationship was ABC of Communism. It comes out in 1919 or 20. And I looked at the reading list there, and Kautsky, pre-war Kautsky, way outweighs pre-war Lenin, except on very technical agricultural questions. That's where Lenin is cited. What is to be done is not even cited in that reading list. So, and the publication of books under the Soviet rule by Kautsky continued even more, because now we're in power. And when Lenin died, he had more books by Kautsky than any other author in his library, including a majority of books that were published by the Soviets. So I could go on for other sort of. But if the Bolsheviks didn't collapse in 1914, it's not because they weren't reading Kautsky or ignoring Kautsky or not learning from Kautsky, because that's who they were learning from. That's what they were. So whatever other reason, it's either it's not that they rejected Kautsky. Kautsky rejected them. Then I just want to mention the sort of idea that Lenin was so shocked that he sort of went into seclusion and either wrote imperialism or studied Hegel, and then emerged later with a new view. That's just not right. As a matter of fact, well, I'll put a plug in for a book that's going to be published next spring, a short biography, and I describe, a very short book, describe the train voyage he made. He was kicked out of Poland, where he was living, and he has this train thing, and he gets out, like I think in the first week of September, and he walks straight from the station to a Bolshevik meeting and says, "Here's the thesis, guys, here's the program." So he took no time whatsoever to come up with a program and start fighting this. And what was that program based on? Well, in December 1914, just to indicate, but I've got a lot more, but I'm just giving this as a striking quote. He writes to a guy, Shapnikov, he says, "Have you read Kautsky's Road to Power, the 1909 book? Well, if you haven't, read it. And read what that man says there about the revolution of our times." And now he plays the toady and renounces all that. Okay, so that sums it up. The reason Lenin was able to walk from the station and start no time at all with his program was because he had it already. And he had it already because he got it from Kautsky. So that's, I mean, not all Kautsky, but he says, we left Zimmerwald's people, that's the group he was with during this war, we stand for what Kautsky said before 1909. Imperialism is, in a large extent, saying Hilferding and Kautsky were right back then. Why are they finked out? It's a protection of orthodoxy against change. So, okay, well, I could go on with Kautsky forever. I'm fascinated by that topic. Yeah, and I've only got 5 minutes left. So let me go on to the professional revolutionary business. Okay, so I think the discussion got the main points here. So I'll kind of be brief, which is Lenin wanted a professional an organization that would work, and he didn't solve the problems that come with those organizations. He may have even, in fact, been a bit naive about them. I think he was. But, okay, so that's the way it goes. It's up to everybody else to solve these problems. Now, and it had nothing to do with the main thing we're talking about is something that occurs everywhere, and may occur even more in a legal, open situation. So everyone should read the book by Robert Michels called Democracy.
Yeah,
Political parties. Yeah, political parties. Sorry, it's a strange name because what it is he talks using the SPD as his model, and he uses the SPD because it's so committed to democratism. He says so it's a tough case for him. He puts forth the iron law of oligarchy, which says all the things that have come up. He sort of writes it out. They get separated. They have the knowledge problem. So this is the most This is a problem with any institution. Lenin, living where he was, I think was rather naive about the effects of full democracy. So read the section, What Has He Done, when he talks about playing at democratism. And read what he says, why he says we can't do it. It's a big hymn of praise to what can be done when you have legal open institutions. You can have, and he uses the Germans as an example, but he's just talking. He says you can find. Here's what we cannot do. We cannot find out who people are. We cannot openly judge them on their records. We cannot. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes, whereas they do. Ha-ha. I mean, so I should read that. I think he's being rather naive about the effect. And as a matter of fact, there's sort of a tendency to say, well, the underground institutions led to dictatorial things, and I can see that, but. Also, they ended up being more democratic because if some guy didn't want to pay his dues, he just didn't pay his dues. I mean, because of the difficulty of having any organization at all, they had to be. You had to have your. You had to have your roots in the working class. You had to have people voted by helping you or not helping you at a great risk themselves. So in many ways, they in some sense, the Russian underground was more democratic by necessity, by circumstances, than something like the SPD, which was getting fossilized and so forth. Also, the underground, more and more as they went along, had more and more of a problem with the basic thing of provocation, of turncoats, of informers, like Malinowski that I talk about in my thing. This got to be a serious problem to the sort of threatening the existence of the underground. It was so pervasive. And so the way I say it is, you're not going to have the dream, Lenin's dream of professional, but you have to have that norm. You have to fight for it in order to survive at all, given the very difficulties of existing under these tough conditions. Let me get to the more technical question of the translation of awareness. Okay, I'm not for some reason not 100% sure what I'm about to say, but I think what it is the reason I came up with that translation is that there's a problem in the Russian text in that there are two words, two nouns, soznanya and soznatelnost. You can tell that they're rather related, and the root is znanya, which is to knowledge, and they're both translated consciousness. And a Russian native speaker gave me the tip-off that they don't mean the same thing. So I diligently went through and tried to find out the meaning, and they are different. So one, which I translated awareness, soznanya, is it was talking about beliefs, and the other one was talking about sort of, which I translated purposiveness, which maybe it's not the best term, but it meant, getting down and really doing your stuff in a goal-oriented way. I guess goal-oriented is another, just sort of having your act together and not being so. And what was essential for me was to separate them out and to give some justification for it. But the real opposite to stachinus is not awareness. This is, I think, my answer to you. I'm not 100% sure. I'm supporting my own self correctly. It's mainly the other one. I can't even say it. Purposiveness. And so what you want to do is move from stachinus to sort of, stachinus, which translates spontaneity, but I never did come up with a good translation of it, but elementalness will usually work. It's like when you have a strike and you go out and beat up it's unorganized, you march down to the factory, you beat up the people, you take the foreman out in a wheelbarrow and toss them into the river, and you set fire to the factory. So that's stachini, because it's not organized, it doesn't have coherent names, it's not very, so what you want to do is move from that to, not to soznanya, of course you want to soznanya, not to awareness so much, as just doing it right. So a strike action, which has no idea of being socialist, can be purposive, and you want to help to move that, but also your job, and it's more particularly your job, is to bring the awareness. That is to say, the party's job is more particularly focused on awareness, so that's why I think what you were kind of saying, I'm not sure. Whereas the worker movement will sort of, not automatically, but will move in and of itself to a more, they'll start off with the very stachini, the elemental outbursts, and then they'll work. They'll just get their act together more and more. They don't really need the party for that sort of thing. What they do need it is to bring awareness, socialist awareness. So it's kind of complicated because he throws those terms together so much. And the funny thing is that opposition, stachinus, purposiveness, it's really pretty much here in What Is to Be Done. You can't find other works where it's a big deal. I mean, you can find it, but it's not something it focuses on much. And the reason it's a big deal in that one chapter 2 really, of What Is to Be Done is because those words were used by the people attacking him, and the way he worked was always to take up the words that other people used and run them through the mill. So oftentimes you will find him expressing thoughts in weird vocabulary, and when that happens I usually look carefully at the page and realize that he's quoting other people. And oftentimes you will find people quoting Lenin when I know that he says, see what the kind of words choices he uses here? It's the other people's word choices. So anyway, well, thank you for a good discussion.